the Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spaniola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversation with everyday folks about the mystery of life. This podcast is a complement to the Numinous School, my online intuition development program for people who want their self-awareness to serve a greater good. I'm your host, Carmen Spaniola, and today on the podcast, I'm speaking with Dr. Jennifer Jacquet. Jennifer is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Studies at NYU. She's interested in examining large-scale cooperative dilemmas like conservation, overfishing, and climate change. She's also the author of the book, Is Shame Necessary? New Uses for an Old Tool. Jennifer believes that shaming is a form of resistance that can be used to challenge institutions, organizations, and even governments in order to bring about large-scale change. I spoke with Jennifer online. She was in New York City. So Jennifer, what identities do you lead with?
Well, especially when I'm doing an interview, I think I'm an assistant professor of environmental studies at NYU, and I'm also part of our animal studies initiative here. I also have a partial appointment in the Stern School of Business and in the Center for Data Science, so I'm interested in working across many disciplines. I'm born and raised in Ohio, and but then have been living on the coast sort of since I was 18, 19, so I'm one of those recruits from the Midwest.
That's great.
And I lived in Vancouver for 7 years, so I consider myself a kind of honorary Canadian, even though I didn't formally apply for the citizenship.
Absolutely. You can always come back. It's home away from home. It seems like your work would fit right in on this coast in Vancouver anyway. So you write about and study and are interested in large-scale cooperative dilemmas. And I discovered your work through your book, Is Shame Necessary? New Uses for an Old Tool. And I just want to ask you directly, do you think shame is a necessary tool for engaging with large-scale cooperative dilemmas?
Yes, I do. And I think that is contrary to sort of a lot of titles with question marks. Apparently, often the answer always is no. And so it was a bit of a paradox, I guess. But yes, I think it's not only necessary, but a sort of only option in a lot of cases in these large scale dilemmas that you mentioned. So with regards to, let's say, climate change or human rights issues, where we're really talking about having a system of sort of global values, which is completely new in the 21st century. It started in the 20th century, but the 21st century, we're really going to see, I think, shame put to use even more. So I got interested in it as a tool and interested in the ways that people seem to be comfortable with it on the one hand and then really uncomfortable with it on the other. And I know we plan to talk about some of those.
Yeah, I'm very excited to talk to you about the response you got from your book, because I know the response I get just from citing your book is often not terribly receptive. But before we get there, I know some people already are tensing up at framing shame as quote unquote a good thing. Yeah. So I just want to give you a chance to kind of frame your argument here a bit, because some people may be conflating what you mean with guilt or embarrassment or humiliating people. So can you just sort of talk about the distinctions between guilt and shame and, that spectrum of experience of shame?
Yeah, and this is, it gets really territorial. So I just had to lay out in the book sort of where I was, the point of view I was coming from. And I think like pain, shame is very much an aversive experience. No one loves experiencing pain and no one loves experiencing shame. You're not going to find people arguing like we should have more of this in our life. But there's no doubt with either mechanism or tool that it's a useful adaptation, right? I mean, I'm certainly glad I feel pain, glad I don't lose my hand on the stovetop, even though I don't appreciate much the actual experience of it. And that's a little bit like shame too. I try to avoid it, but if we step back and look at it as an adaptation, as a mechanism for social control, then we can start to see its benefits. And that doesn't mean, of course, that we should embrace it and hope to experience it. It still means we should try to avoid it. So I distinguish sort of between shame, guilt, and embarrassment in the following ways. Shame for my book was about the experience that you have when you've transgressed, and that transgression is exposed to an audience. And so an audience is really a precondition in my definition. Now, I know that there are other scholars and other thinkers who say, look, you can experience shame on your own, but it was the most useful way for me to think about it as an experience and also as a tool. And it also then helps distinguish it from guilt, which is something that you do feel. Some people say you feel alone in the dark. Guilt is who you are, sort of with yourself at the end of the day. And then embarrassment's a really interesting kind of distinct feeling from shame, I think, in the sense that often an audience is also involved. But what it is that the transgression tends to not be morally loaded in any way. So, you have toilet paper on your shoe, or you're underdressed for an event, or you slip up and use the wrong term. And that doesn't necessarily say something about who you are as a person. And it doesn't say even something necessarily about your moral orientation. And so I tend to distinguish embarrassment as something where the stakes are just much lower. And a lot of scholars do agree that shame, kind of the experience and the tool, is intended to say something about your whole self, like who you are as a person, which is of course why it's also so dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I frequently have, whenever I bring up shame, there's another famous writer who is cited, and sometimes there's a few. And so I frequently hear people say, well, shame is toxic. It's about who you are. Guilt is about what you've done. And there's kind of these like rules of thumb now that I think are in the popular consciousness about that equate shame with badness, because there's been a popular message about shame is I am bad. And on the one hand, I absolutely appreciate the usefulness of that tool, but in certain contexts. So I guess I want, for people listening to place this definition of shame in the larger context of large-scale cooperative dilemma. And can you also just clarify what you mean by that, or what is meant by that term as well?
Yeah, so I'm talking about cases where we all have a sort of stake in the outcome, basically, either because we directly share the same air or water or atmosphere or wildlife, or because the issue has become so important, like child labor or human rights, that it's kind of on the global moral agenda. And those are the kinds of issues that I was tackling in the book. So I think what you're also describing, there were a number of books that came out last year on shame, or 2015 on shame. And there was a problem with some of them in the sense that a lot of people get concerned about shame, which is a sort of form of punishment. And the real issue that they're concerned about is the disproportionality, that people are punished disproportionately to what their transgression was. And that tends to happen especially online. And so my goal with this book was to kind of tease out all those things and make more nuanced arguments, saying, why do we feel okay in this situation, but we think that Justine Sacco and what she experienced for a single tweet, losing her job and whatever, is so outlandish. And I felt like shame was getting swept into other issues that were actually making people uncomfortable. Like they were like saying shame is bad. It was like, no, actually it's the disproportionality that's upsetting you, because I can show you these other cases and you say those are fine. So I was interested in trying to tease those things apart. And as a result, making a more nuanced argument is never, it's not an easy thing to do. Like, you sort of have to talk about it for 40 to 50 minutes. It's hard to do in a single soundbite. And but I was trying to, in a way, defend shame against what I saw as a kind of public backlash.
And so it's so interesting because you started off by saying, of course, none of us want to feel shame. And so we have this sort of evolutionary adaptation that makes us averse. And so what that says to me is, okay, so that's a super powerful tool. And in these large sort of moral collective dilemmas, we have to use all of the tools, and some of them are going to be very potent and powerful. And yet, I sometimes wonder if, because people get so uncomfortable when I suggest that, I can only imagine how it went for you. But when I suggest that, I also wonder if that's what they're responding to, is that disproportionality. Do you think that does something in us, like closes us off to even wanting to deal with the problem, if we think that the tools that we have to use, we're not sort of socially, even evolutionarily mature enough to use them? Like if we live in a soundbite culture, but we need 40 minutes just to define the terms, then do you think that that also has a bit of backlash, because maybe people don't even want to deal with the subject if it means that we are going to use these tools poorly?
Well, I mean, the other option, of course, is just to call it something different so that it doesn't trigger that kind of response in people. And one of the ways that shame gets complicated is we do call it shaming when we single out an organization or a corporation like Exxon for its efforts to thwart climate policy. We were like, oh, we've been shaming Exxon, and even the corporations are using that language. And what we know for certain is that the experience of a corporation being shamed is really fundamentally different from an individual being shamed. So I can't really project. I don't think Exxon doesn't get a spike in cortisol. It doesn't blush. It doesn't want to hide. It doesn't have that kind of moral emotion, right, as an institution, as a group. And so part of my argument in the book, too, was the way that shame scales to the group level in a way that some other forms of punishment don't, and trying maybe in that way also to disarm people about its potency, I guess, or its affect.
Mm-hmm. What else would you call shame if we were going to use it? Do you have some like other little phrase that pays that people might pick up?
Well, I mean, social exposure is sometimes just a kind of stand-in that doesn't trigger, that same sort of no. And yeah, I mean, it's funny, even in the climate negotiations at Paris, some people were positioning as a naming and shaming policy, that we would name and shame countries that didn't keep their pledges. And others said, no, let's call it pledge and review, which is a kind of less loaded, in other words, maybe we're just going to point out all the people who did the right thing or the countries who did the right thing. And so, there are other options out there. But in part, I was taking advantage of how politically loaded the term is, because I thought it might draw people into the conversation, and get them to think about, why am I uncomfortable with it in this case and not in others?
Mm-hmm. Now, some of the research in your book were experiments with like sharing experiments and things like that. So it wasn't that you were doing your direct research necessarily with scales like corporations, although there were some interesting things about voting turnout and stuff. I wonder if you could just share, I don't know, just a little bit about some of the experiments that you did that were the most eye-opening for you around shame.
Yeah, so I mean, I can describe one I did, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, my primary interest is in sort of the institutional level. It's very hard to run an experiment that way. So we constantly go back to that individual, and it's not actually for me, what I'm most interested in. So I provide some empirics around also corporations that have been exposed and for what. And I've tried to do more research on that since the book came out. But in our experiment, because also what's nice is if you can kind of demonstrate it in a lab, people then take it as a sort of proof of concept. And we had a cooperative game basically where students could give or not to a common pool, and they could give $1 or not at each of 10 rounds. And we gave them the $10 to start with. So And they knew that any money that they earned in the game was theirs to keep. So they're playing for keeps. That money that they donate to the public pool at each round is then doubled and then redistributed evenly among all players, regardless of whether or not you donate it. So it's very much like a group project. They're all familiar with this, where it's like some players could slack and they would still get the A if all the other students made up for them. And what we see, this is called a public goods game, generally is that cooperation tends to be highest in the earliest rounds and then erodes over time. So what we did was introduce two different treatments. And one was that at the end, we had a control condition where everyone was anonymous. And then we also had two other conditions where they are playing under fake names. And we said at the end of these 10 rounds, we're going to expose the two people who donated least out of the 6 players overall. And then we had another condition where we said we're going to expose the 2 players who were most generous out of the 6 players overall. So we were really testing what the threat of shame or the promise of honor meant to these players in the game. And both conditions actually led to about a 50% increase in contributions to the common pool. So what was great about that, of course, is that, again, that sort of proof of concept in the lab that it would work. It goes very much along with our intuitions. Some of the surprising elements, though, were that both shame and honor actually motivated cooperation to about the same degree. And also that we actually then played 2 additional rounds after the exposure. And something happened that was very telling, which was that the students who had gotten the bad reputation then really continued on with that bad reputation and basically completely withdrew their cooperation. And vice versa, the players who were honored felt obligated to maintain their contributions. So we were worried also or thought this was an indication of the kind of stickiness of reputation. And again, speaks to some of the liability of shame, where you don't want maybe somebody to get a terrible reputation and then stop caring about whether or not what the group thinks or whether or not they're really even part of the group. So that was telling as well. And then there have been a lot of other cool experiments done on like threats to expose your voting record, which you kind of mentioned, to your neighbors in a subsequent letter. And that threat of shame led to the greatest actually percentage of voter turnout ever seen by a single piece of mail, which was an 8% increase. Normally you only see like a 1% increase from a piece of mail. So the experimenters were so impressed, but I actually spoke to them and they were like, but in the end also we didn't follow up because so many people were not pleased with that potential outcome. So, and this is what we consistently see in these studies as well, is that the threat of shame is the motivator. And then once people have been shamed, what you see is that they will withdraw, or you'll see at least a short-term effect of that. So it's about saying this is a very effective but dangerous tool. We want to limit its use. We want to really consider when and how we use it and put it to its best use possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you talk in the book about sort of the 7, let's call it like best principles or best habits of how to apply shame. And I think the one that always sticks with me is, I think it might even be the first thing, is that, or one in the first 3, that there needs to be the possibility for the transgressor to be brought back into the fold, that there needs to be the opportunity for them to come back into the group. So we can use shame to say, buddy, you are way outside what is cool for our community, but with repair or remorse or whatever is needed, you can come back in. And that seems to be, I don't know, that just really stuck with me about, certainly when I scale this down to collective dilemmas that are not necessarily transnational, but say national, like things like white supremacy, things like racism, when you have calling out culture that silences some people or drives behaviors underground, that becomes very tricky. How do we say your behavior is so not on, and here's how you can come back into the fold? And I think that was another huge insight from the book, is that shame and honor have this beautiful dynamic relationship. But I am wondering how effective shame can be in a culture that isn't very literate with the concept of honor. When I think of hyper individualistic cultures, honor is kind of not, I mean, status is
Yeah.
something, but I don't think honor is something that has quite the potency in the North American culture. And so I am curious about what you've noticed about that shame honor relationship in collectivist cultures versus more individualistic cultures.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to be, I guess, a little less um, dramatic about the differences, I guess, than some people are. And that's just because I see that they manifest themselves in different ways. So,
Mm.
I mean, for instance, corporations are tracking their reputation as closely as they're tracking their financial profile.
Mm.
And that seems really interesting to me. And they're interested in getting good press, of course, and they're very interested in avoiding bad. So yeah, I mean, so corporations are tracking their own reputation so closely, and while you wouldn't call that honor or honor seeking, it is a kind of orientation around reputation that I think is not equivalent but consistent with the view that I'm taking in the book, that shame and honor are both important. Um, yeah, the way that I mean, I don't see honor as being as useful as a tool in certain kinds of dilemmas because we really don't worry about the people who are performing well. I see shame as being a much stronger option, but it really depends on the structure and nature of the problem. But your question is really about collectivist versus individualistic cultures, and the shame stuff is interesting. A lot of people have argued, for instance, that Japan has a much stronger shame culture. Eastern cultures generally, in China, there's a lot of conversation around saving face or losing face. Again, we don't have that same necessarily loaded language, and it's not as prevalent in our literature, but it does still seem to be a huge part of our culture. But perhaps in the way things are even more interesting is in the guilt issue, because in certain Eastern cultures, they don't even have a word for guilt. And so a lot of people have argued there was a really cool study done by Dan Fessler, an anthropologist at UCLA, and he looked at just kind of what emotions are most commonly discussed in two different cultures, one in Los Angeles and then one in Bengkulu, Indonesia. And in Indonesia, guilt is like one of the most discussed and commonly experienced, so they argue, emotions. But in LA, shame is super, super low on the list. Instead, what's very high on the list is guilt. And in Bengkulu, they don't even have a word for guilt.
Okay, sorry.
So,
So actually, you said originally that guilt was one of the biggest things they talked about in Benkulu, but did you mean shame is one of the
oh,
biggest?
sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So shame was one of the most commonly discussed emotions in Bengkulu, not guilt. They
Okay.
don't even have a word for guilt.
Wow. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so what's interesting there is that you can argue, as some people have, that guilt has taken the place in our culture of what shame once represented.
Mm.
And my own ideas around that, of course, are the individualistic orientation versus the collectivist, but also that, a lot of us live alone in the US. We spend much more time alone than they do, for instance, in their culture. And so these kind of more social emotions, or emotions you experience among others, have diminished relative to the emotions you're expected to experience alone, like guilt. And so there are kind of sociological issues there that are interesting too.
Mm.
So I think that also plays a role, that you might say, well, we don't feel that much shame, but a lot of people do feel a lot of guilt. And the argument, of course, is that that's a much cheaper emotion because it doesn't require an audience and it doesn't require the audience to care. And yeah.
I see. Okay, so that's I'm going to have to chew on that for a while, but that's a very interesting distinction and sort of refocusing of that question. Now, you said earlier, we have to acknowledge that shame is a very dangerous tool. So I'm curious, when you're thinking about transnational issues, when you're thinking about climate change, um, what would then be the limits of shame? Like, do you really think that China, for instance, um, would compromise? I mean, you can't speak for a nation, I know, but do you really think that people will withdraw from these major collective dilemmas? Do you already see evidence of that because perhaps shame has been employed too strongly?
Well, yes. I mean, for instance, I think I cite this case in the book with North Korea deciding to be part of the World Cup. And when it did that, it kind of then motioned toward a desirability to be part of a global community, right? And that year it experienced sort of disproportionate negative attention. And there were a lot of news stories done around North Korea because it was in the World Cup. And it wound up then withdrawing and deciding not to participate in the World Cup after that. So you do have global examples like that. Again, I think the question is what plays out over the long run. But one area that I'm interested is in some cases, you have corporations that are more responsible in some ways for climate change than individual countries. So I'm following this initiative by Bank Track, it's called. And what they do is single out, for instance, the banks that are most invested in coal production as the dirtiest fuel. And they'll single out, say, JP Morgan Chase as the number one investor in coal around the world. Now, am I really super worried that JP Morgan Chase is not going to participate? Not really. I mean, of course, it would be great to have them on board, and it would be great for them to change their ways and to divest. But in part, what they're signaling here to consumers, to citizens, is take your money out of this bank if you don't want, right, to be part of this, but also using them to say, look, other banks, you don't want to be here getting this negative reputation. And yeah, I understand it is a dangerous tool, and there are liabilities, but part of shame's power as well is to set examples, right? I mean, a really interesting case in the US that happened after I wrote the book was the shaming of this Walter Palmer, the guy who shot Cecil the Lion. He experienced, I mean, he's one of these cases, inarguably disproportionate punishment, right? Like, there are plenty of people that shoot lions all the time in Africa and who have never experienced that level of exposure. But what that incident did, and I disagree with the way, the shame was carried out in several respects, but what it did was catalyze this moment that I never anticipated, which was real anger and rage around trophy hunting as a phenomenon. So if you had said to me, like, how do Americans feel about trophy hunting? I would say sort of neutral. I mean, I wouldn't have guessed. And looking at what happened, and even just mainstream media, I was like, oh, wow, this is a real case of shaming, signaling what is the norm here. What is the standard of the group? And yes, Walter Palmer experienced disproportionate punishment, and he was the fall guy. But what it did too was plant a sort of flag in the soil on where Americans stood on the issue. And so that's a little bit in the case of what's happening too, is that shame is used almost to stigmatize fossil fuel production or investments in fossil fuel. And the bank one is the reason why I love it too, is that they're not going after ExxonMobil because they're like, you know what, it's a fossil fuel company. It's not likely to change its ways, but a bank has a choice. And it can take its money and move it somewhere else. So it's also very strategic. It's saying, like, they can within a year or two change their behavior, and then we could give them honor. And it would be much harder to do that with Peabody or a coal company. So I think that's also very, again, sort of 21st century thinking.
Yeah, I'm curious. What you just said is like, okay, and so if they change their ways, if there's some kind of repair that happens here, we could give them honor. And I said on a different podcast, actually, I was being interviewed then, and the notion comes from your book. But it sort of helped me realize that in a culture that is hyper individualistic, where perfectionism, or at least the appearance of that, is such a high ideal, everyone would rather be perfect than reformed because it implies that you had the fall
Yeah.
from grace. But if there was something we could do to honor, reform, and repair, that feels like a very potent tool for me. So I wonder if you could talk maybe a little bit more about what you think the sweet spot of shame might be. If it's not what happened to the lion killer, what what would be more appropriate? What are some of the parameters for how we can collectively use shame well?
Well, and it's always hard to figure out that what I would call like sort of dose response. It's like a doctor trying to figure out what's the best medicine, how much should we give. It really does vary. We need to know how much the individual weighs, how they respond, what other medicines they're taking. Shame is very much like that. It's not an easy solution. But we do avoid some of those concerns, again, when we're not targeting individuals. So I think we're far less concerned about whether or not JP Morgan is sleeping at night and feels reintegrated, because again, those are not emotions that a corporation, individuals within that corporation may feel that way, and they may leave the corporation if they feel too misaligned with the values of the company. Or they may say this exposure is bogus, and deal with it that way. But in terms of the sweet spot of shame, regardless, it's a little bit like, the Goldilocks principle. You want to get enough attention for it to work, and you don't want to overdo it, because the disproportionality is with any form of punishment, right? Like, we're worried we put people in jail too long for marijuana use. It's all punishments deal with that same exact question. Whether or not it's prison, whether or not it's a monetary fine, right? Like, we've seen tons of cases where the monetary fine is like $200 for, let's say, killing an endangered species, and it's not a deterrent at all. And so in any form of punishment, we come across these same concerns. And that was one of the things I wanted to point out in the book too, is that the sweet spot of shame is also the sweet spot of prison, the sweet spot, we have to give all of these punishments that kind of consideration. But I highlighted in my chapter on the sweet spot of shame sort of the role of the arts, because I think that, and the role of sort of ridicule and satire, because for some reason these forms are a little less potent in some ways. They can be very, very attention getting, but they're not kind of as maybe ostracizing as others. And so that strikes me as something that we'll see more and more of in the future. I mean, I love, and I cited in the book this case where the Yes Man, Jacques Servine, posing as Jude Finisterra, represents supposedly a Dow spokesperson on the BBC. I mean, they thought he was a real spokesperson for Dow Chemical, and apologizes for the Bhopal disaster, Dow Chemical having acquired Union Carbide, who, released all these toxic chemicals from its factory in Bhopal, India. And he apologizes and says, we're going to compensate all the victims. And it's this beautiful performance that looks completely legitimate. In fact, I show it to my business and environment students, and they think they're like, wow, that's amazingly progressive of Dow Chemical. And I'm like, except this guy was not with Dow Chemical. And he got the BBC to sort of buy into this. And Dow Chemical then had to say, not only is this a lie, but we're not doing anything to compensate the victims. And it was a kind of, I mean, it was very shaming, but it was also so artistic and so wonderful that, and I'm sure Dow is not pleased about it to this day, but that it's very hard to disagree with that as sort of, it's art as well as punishment.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're living in the U.S. and you're living under the Trump administration, and we've seen so much of this. Yeah, I apologize. You can always come back.
I'm not sure I'm safe anywhere.
Yeah. But yeah, we can see satire being used. I also find that the satire, whether or not it creates change in the administration's behavior, it helps me feel less alone as a citizen. And it's interesting. I'm very curious how your work may have shifted your life interpersonally, because I had a moment where the light switch kind of flicked for me and I went ballistic at a dinner party at my in-laws' house, and these that my in-laws' best friends were just sort of casually being racist, and I just kind of lost it, like almost flipped the table. We to this day call it the racist dinner party, and I suddenly had this moment where I was like, "There's no audience here, but I can imagine what it would be like if a person of color were listening to you right now, and I am humiliated for you." And so I just laid into them and shamed them. And it was super uncomfortable for everyone. And I just left the table. I didn't even try to reconcile. It's all very awkward still. But something happened for me where I realized that, as you were saying earlier, that sometimes, there's a fall guy, but it signals to the collective what's acceptable and what's not. And so it's a form of social proof. So when we see satire that is shaming an administration, there's a relief that comes for the rest of us who feel powerless, that I personally feel really grateful to all the artists that put themselves on the line and make themselves so vulnerable that way. I'm wondering if, as you were writing the book, or as you've been thinking about shame and reputation over the years so deeply and doing these experiments, have you had any personal shifts, or how does this show up in your life? Because I imagine that you get a lot of pushback.
Well, something that I think that this book helped do more for me, and more of for me, and I was already sort of gesturing that way, but I really, through thinking through shame so much, have decided that for instance, I didn't put this in the book, but people say, well, would you use shame on your children? And I wouldn't. I mean, if I have kids, I probably will not use shame. That's how dangerous I think of a tool it is, and how, sort of touch and go. And it's not something I would want to do to somebody I loved if I had another alternative choice. Mm-hmm. And it's helped me think through, like, what are the stakes here, and who is actually making the biggest impact on this issue, or global concern, or shared dilemma, and really trying to constantly direct my focus there. So part of shame is that it can be very distracting, that it can be used also as a distraction, I think, from either the people who are really at fault, or the companies who are really at fault, or even from the issues that really matter. So for me, it's constantly a kind of recalibration and a backing down from trying to, just deal with your sort of immediate environs versus a much bigger picture stuff. So, they always say, like, don't sweat the small stuff. At the same time, like you're talking about, there are things that may, like with my in-laws, who are lovely, but they'll often, I don't eat animals, and they often will, kind of push back on that, and they'll say, what, sort of, what if we could get them to not contribute to climate change? And luckily my partner steps in, and they'll be like, but no, she doesn't think we should eat animals as like a sort of welfare, and try to defend my norm, or my standard. But I sort of thought, like, I should save whatever I'm about to direct toward them, or say, for, sort of Cargill or something.
Right.
Because you have to conserve your energy on
Mm-hmm.
these points.
Mm-hmm.
But also it can be cathartic, like you said, to see your values reflected, whether or not it's at a dinner party, or or on television, or whatever. And so it's just always, I think I've gotten more sociological about shame. You know what I mean? I'm too meta sometimes. Right. And I saw this happen, actually, after the book came out, with this really cool effort. I loved it, called Manel Shaming. So it was about shaming the all-male panel at events. And it was crowdsourced, and people would just send in a photo, let's say, of like 12 men on stage. And David Hasselhoff is giving the thumbs up in every photo. And it's a very clever, fun use of again, sort of gender politics. But then I noticed, a friend also pointed out, they were shaming even 2- and 3-person panels of men. And an academic actually came up with a whole distribution calculator, but like assuming that women represent 50% of the population, which is almost never the case in these expert roles, but assuming they do, there's a 25% chance that you have a panel of two men. And so I kind of wrote this a small piece actually for a German outlet, but on the sort of science of shaming too. And that you see that, come on, the mantle shaming was a good idea, but I don't know at what point the threshold should exist, but there should be a threshold where you go, well, the 2 or 3 person panel is not worthy. The 12 definitely is. And then there's the line somewhere between those, right? And so then I get all academic and people are like, yeah, but what about the emotions? And I'm like, no, there's a science here. And yeah, I'm that boring person. That's probably it's the way it's infected me interpersonally too, is people are like, don't get into shame with her. Right. It'll be a 20-minute conversation.
And she needed 40. So
yeah.
She's going to make it super.
She's going to talk really fast. Yeah.
Right. So where is your work on shame and reputation taking you? Like, which collective dilemmas are sort of driving your work these days?
Yeah, I mean, I continue to work on climate change and overfishing, and I have a new project on the wildlife trade. But those have always kind of been in my general interest. I mean, I'm interested in animal issues generally, animal welfare, animal rights, and human rights and human welfare issues. So the way that those norms are sort of seeded and encouraged in the global sphere is really interesting to me still. And like I said, since the book came out, I started following Bank Track more closely for the work that they're doing. And I'm really following sort of what will happen with the Paris Agreement, because reputation is really built into the mechanism there. And like the issues that sometimes come up, like the mantle shaming. I mean, I'm still definitely interested in watching reputation. But I also am working more directly on some of the practical approaches to solving these large scale problems. Not that shame is impractical, but to the extent that we're even building a computer algorithm to detect illegal wildlife trade online, that kind of stuff.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
So interesting. Do you feel hopeful about large-scale collective dilemmas? Maybe the next book you could write could be on hope, because I have a bit of an ambivalent relationship there.
No, that's perfectly reasonable. And in fact, a student was just in my office saying that climate change was so overwhelming to him that he was doing a project on it, and he was like, I really honestly don't know where to start. And so I said something then that I've been thinking about a lot since, and I feel very privileged and hopeful about, which is that so many people that have fought for things for so long, let's say the end of slavery, women's rights, child labor, any of those issues, they went to their grave seeing no progress on the issues that they were probably really and maybe more passionate or rageful about than I am about these things. And I think that must have been so hard, because in my life, my 35 years, I've seen so much progress on the issues that I care about, and there still needs to be so much more, or I shouldn't say care about, but work on directly. Because I care about a lot of things that aren't changing too, but the things that I work on, I'm seeing changes. And I feel so heartened that, assuming I don't die tomorrow, I may die with a major shift in thinking about animals in agriculture or the wildlife trade. And that helps me a lot, because to think about that privilege to get to be part of something and see it enacted. And I think that will continue to happen. I mean, like I said, I was even just so impressed with the social signaling over trophy hunting. I'm really hopeful, actually, with the general orientation of values. Now, good thing you didn't do this interview in November, because I was feeling far less hopeful. But I still think that over the course of, life is not exactly long, but it's not 4 years either. We will see major shifts, and that's really a position of privilege, and I derive a lot of hope from that.
Maybe I should have asked you the last question penultimately, I should have asked this before, but if you go back, remember something that makes you feel really bad.
Oh, I don't have to remember. It's there all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you personally then cope with grief and rage when you are thinking about these massive, like something you may not, I would argue, likely will not see major shifts on in your lifetime, like
Yeah.
perhaps climate change, or enough that would
Yeah.
help our children out a bit? How do you deal with grief?
Or not in the time frame that I would have preferred.
Right. Mhm.
Um, and I would say that probably I use one to answer the other, which is if I just sat here alone in the dark, grief would be the overwhelming. I mean, I you really look around and you look at some of the things and you look at how out of your control they are. And I think the grief is like a tidal wave. I mean, um, and so instead, but you turn the lights on and you face the world. And for me, I really use rage as a very motivating. I find rage sort of focuses my thoughts much more than any other emotion, certainly more than joy.
Mm.
So I get really angry about something and I can write a paper almost that instant in a day, if I'm that angry. And that's of course why like bad restaurant reviews, right, are fun to read, because we know rage is so motivating. Um, but I think one thing I worry about a little bit is how, again, people are saying you shouldn't feel pain, you shouldn't feel shame, you shouldn't feel rage. It's actually like, well, embrace that moment for what it is and try to turn it into a productive force. So I don't discourage my students from feeling those emotions if they can make them productive, because I do think it's very motivating. And what I'm looking for in the 21st century is who are the villains? Who can I hold responsible? Because I'm tired of blaming myself and where I was born and what I consume because of, just adopting a sort of status quo life. And I try not to do those things. But as you know, like, so I don't fly and I don't go visit my family and I don't, it would all be self-imposed. It
Mm.
would all be, and so I'm tired of blaming myself and I'm looking and I'm ready to direct my rage towards something else. And I think, the more of us who are willing to do that and the more of us who are willing to do it for very little, let's say monetary reward, the better, because that's what's so heartening about this administration in the US is, if you can find anything, is that you see that a culture that was sort of said was apathetic and so oriented around money is showing up at the airport, hiring babysitters to watch their kids while they go protest. And I am like, oh, see, we're not so bad.
Totally. I'm all choked up now. Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Well, I'm really glad that the people who are articulating strategy for us, like yourself, are able to galvanize and direct the flow of rage and the energy of that into something so productive and show us how it's done. Thank you so much for being on the show, Jennifer. I so appreciate your work and the insights that you brought today.
Well, and I appreciate the 40 minutes needed to talk about it. So thank you very much.
A juicy topic with so much to chew on. So much so that I think I need to bring in Ruben Anderson for another installment of Rubenation. Welcome back to the show, Ruben.
Hello there.
I'm so glad we finally get to talk sort of more publicly, but also sort of jam on the author's thoughts. Like, I was so excited that we got to kind of go behind the scenes of this book and this topic because, as you know, I've been a bit obsessed with it for a while.
Yes, you have.
Yes. And we can only get so far, just you and I swimming around in our little fishbowl. So having heard Jennifer talk about shame in this way, what were your thoughts?
Well,
first of all, it was kind of exciting for me. A little bit of plug here for our dear friend J.B. McKinnon,
I knew he'd get pulled in
author
somewhere.
of the Once and Future World, because I think I first heard of Jennifer Jacquet
Yes.
through, I think JB talked to her
Yeah.
in his research on shifting baselines, maybe. So how wonderful then that, and as you mentioned, he gave the Shame book to you. So.
Yes. And it's like filled with little post-it note arrows in the side. So many notes. I felt like she gave oxygen to the fire I had in me for shame.
I have a whole chunk of thought on shame and behavior change, which maybe we should talk about later if you want.
Okay.
I found your conversation with her super interesting. There was just the one example I pulled out. She gave the example of voting. A threat of shame increased voting by 8%.
And then they didn't even do the thing because
Yeah.
people were so
Yeah.
they didn't even expose them socially because people could not stand it.
They couldn't take it. Yeah, and there's a lot of conversation. So I've spent a lot of time working in recycling and garbage, and shame.
Meaning you're not actually lifting garbage or recycling.
Yeah,
You've
that's right.
spent, thinking and writing and speaking about behavior change around getting people
Around
to recycle.
pro-environmental behaviors, I like to call it.
Pro-environmental behaviors,
not
I like
just,
that.
Not just recycling and waste reduction, but
Yeah.
also things like
Gung
water
ho team.
conservation, etc.
Let's be pro. Yeah.
Yeah, pro. So shame is something that's talked a lot about in the blue box effect. The theory is that if you have a blue box on your street, you recycle more than if you're in an apartment building with just a big blue tote. And that's because the theory is there's sort of a shame effect at play.
And I've totally felt it.
I've actually tested it, and I'm a little skeptical of it. But the Township of Langley, I believe, I did a huge shout out to them in one of my talks because the Township of Langley actually tested using an unhappy face sticker. They tested using a frowning face sticker, which I felt the continent of North America rock a little bit when they did that. It was
Where did
so
the frowny sticker
transgressive.
go? How would they point out the people who didn't have their blue box there?
So I think it was maybe if they found recyclables in your garbage or something, they would put a frowny face sticker on.
Sad hobo clown little picture.
Yeah.
Got it.
So shame has been discussed. It, as you say, with the voting example, it's something that people are really, really reluctant to use.
Super averse. Yeah. Nobody wants the wah wah right outside their house or, in their mail. Nobody wants to be exposed, right?
Yeah. And that leads right to one of the parts that I found most interesting was her definition. So she said shame is collectivist, whereas guilt is individual. And so guilt, because it's individual, it doesn't have the power or the impact of the collectivist shame. So I thought that was just a super clarifying bit of her research.
I also, though, so I've been, of course, I've been noodling on shame in relation to racism, and that when we call out racist behavior, it's a form of social proof, and also it demonstrates our commitment to developing a different identity, which is one where I am a person who will put up with no bullshit around racism, and so to violate my commitment to that would be embarrassing for me. So I've been kind of using that, but then again, she talks about disproportionality, and I was like, ooh, yeah, humans, we're not great about that. So that's always been the part that gave me pause about sort of promoting, public shaming more widely. However, I think it's an important conversation to have about honor and reformed behavior, and I can see now more benefit to centering the honor aspect than I did before, because if we can develop a sense of honor in our culture for certain behaviors, it's way easier to use shame when we need interventions. So so I'm still not sure how good our culture could ever be at using shame as a tool after this. However, also what she said about it just scales so well that corporations don't have cortisol shoot up when we shame them and expose their behaviors, whereas individuals do. I was like, okay, well, maybe we could get much better at it with governments and that sort of thing. Anyway, thoughts?
Wow. I feel like we need to pause this so I can play the tape back, and because you just said like 8 things, all of which
Yeah.
were super interesting.
I've been thinking about it a long time.
Yeah, well, that was actually, this is next on my list. Is I just wanted to hear you talk about this because you have been thinking about it for so long.
Well, I don't want to center myself. I just enjoyed being able to, hear from Jennifer what her thoughts are, especially since she's spending a lot of time on large scale social problems that I think many of the conversations we are having in our society are the wrong conversation to have in the face of catastrophic climate change. So I think history's going to prove me right on that, and will wish that we had spent a whole lot more time focusing on really how do we apply all of the tools that we currently have and are experimenting with on that problem, because the climate doesn't care even about racism that much. And so anyway, I really liked being able to add that perspective.
The discussion of honor is interesting. I think my gut reaction is that our culture, so a sort of a North American settler capitalist individualistic
Yes.
kind of approach,
Thank you for your clarity.
is sort of deliberately opposed to honor. Like the measurement of success is more like money and stuff. And if you have to do dishonorable things on the way, then most of our universities are named after those people. So
And our streets.
and our streets,
absolutely.
right? So I feel like it's a pretty long road to build a large scale and certainly a shared sense of honor in North American or in Western industrialized capitalist.
Well, and so this
sort
is
of
why
culture.
I think that is the scale we need to operate at the community level.
Right.
Whereas we could use shame right now way more at the larger scale, I think, on corporations, governments, institutions.
But the thing is, all those groups are actually really expert at deflecting. They've all got entire departments dedicated to deflecting. So, we see such and such an airline will do something bad, and then they tweet out an abject apology. If they're smart, they tweet out an abject apology. They don't fight it. But does their business actually fundamentally change? Like, do they actually transform how they go about doing business? I'm not so sure about
that's
that.
what I think you should read her book, because there's actually quite a bit of research in there.
Right.
I think things do happen behind the scenes that affect change and policy, which you and I mean, man, if we had $1 for every time we talked about policy in our house, we could buy a house.
That's right. We'd have many, many houses.
Yeah, anyway. So her book really, it does provide that, and we could go through the bibliography and look at all of her studies. However, because they have such great spin machines, they can't let people know that they've changed policy.
Right.
So anyway,
Yeah.
we're hijacking her interview. Was there anything else you wanted to?
Well, I guess, as I said, I would like to hear you talk more about the personal scale. So you just said we could be using this a lot more in the interpersonal scale, which is actually where this collectivist experience resides. So the power of it being like, oh man, I'm going to look like a jerk in front of these 5 people is actually super potent.
Yeah, well, and I think of it personally like a muscle. There's kind of, I haven't done exercise in a long time, but I'm pretty sure it still matters that you have a strong core if you want to have a strong back. That was a big thing for a while in the fitness industry. I think it probably still is. This idea that if you want to have overall health, you have to have a strong core. And so the way I look at shame and feeling like an idiot when I screw up, particularly in areas of social justice, because that's where I'm screwing up the most lately in my life, is that sitting in the discomfort of humiliation is like doing sit-ups. I have to do it to have a strong enough core to be healthy overall. And so we need, I believe, I'll say me, I have come to the conclusion that I need to be able to fail in public because there is no good way to be a white settler and dismantle systems of oppression. There's just no way to do it comfortably. And I'm going to mess up because I'm so blind to so many things. So I try to not cover my tracks after I screw up publicly. I try to I throw stuff out there. So, fairly recently there was that video of the professor on BBC who was getting interviewed, and then his kids come in, so awesome. And then his wife comes in and grabs the kids, and she appears to be of Asian descent, and I assumed that was his nanny. And so when I reposted it, I said, this is me being racist. This is hilarious. The nanny comes in. Oh, wait, it's not the nanny. It's his wife. And tons of people were like, oh my God, I did the same thing. And so that was me actually making space to fail. I didn't have to tell anybody I did that. But that's the way I see us getting better with how to use shame, is showing reformed behavior and being proud of it. So I said this in the interview where I was the guest with Rachel and Mary Beth on Confronting Whiteness, that I said, in our Western culture of hyper-individualism, everyone wants to be perfect, but nobody wants to be reformed. So I think we need to offer examples of our own reformation and ways in which we have improved to give other people permission to do the same. And it's super uncomfortable. And of course there's a whole other thing we get into on like wanting, social justice cookies for like, oh, look at me. There's lots of different reasons why we do this. Not all of them would be great. Human beings all have light and dark. We all have shadow stuff that come up here. However, I think there's so much value in developing the Constitution to withstand a bit more shame.
On the fitness analogy, it really is a no pain, no gain sort of thing.
Totally. Absolutely. Which is why I'm constantly aching.
You're gaining so much.
Yeah. Hopefully somebody's gaining. That's what we're going for. Anything else before we wrap up?
That's a really interesting thing in that you described shame. It's almost like you're preempting your own shame by you're sharing it. You're like...
Yeah, but I only got to that after getting called out.
Right.
Fortunately for me, fairly gently and by, really well-intentioned people. I've had people go, what? I've gone to people and said, I said this thing, and why did this person get upset? And the person I was confiding in was like, what the hell did you say that for? What a dumb thing to say. And then I'm like, what? Anyway, so I've had those gentle moments of being humiliated just in front of one person. And anyway, so I've built it up. Yeah, I've built it up over time.
But it does kind of scale, that we see the things like, the politician that has an affair and then they deny it and then they throw their phone in the river and then, they go through all these...
You're watching too many Netflix. I'm judging the river if you ever get...
they go through all these layers, right? And at the end of it, they're in the House of Cards, they're a lying, murdering, Whereas if they just said, oh yeah, I was working too hard, my assistant
the first thing they would say
totally
is,
cute, and
I am a shit.
Okay,
and I'm sorry.
I'm a shit. I'm sorry, and I did this.
I don't need to know all the other stuff. Let's just coach you through this in case. No, I'm just joking.
So if they just kind of like, the faster you own up to it, and the fewer levels of crap you add on to yourself in the effort to not actually go through that pain experience, not actually go through the growth experience.
Yeah.
It's kind of a shame. It seems like it should be easier.
It is a shame.
It is a shame.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your thoughts and helping me process it all, Ruben.
Always a pleasure.
And I want to thank Jennifer again for coming on. I'm kind of a fangirl of her academic book. Let's give a shout out. Where should we shout out to today? I'm going to give you the sheet. Surprise me.
Oh, it has to be off this first page of these many pages of countries
Yeah,
that
those ones have
follow
already
you?
been
Okay.
checked off.
I'm going to say other regions.
Yeah, like Saskatchewan.
There are
and
37
actually,
listeners in other regions.
I happen to know that there are listeners in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And they know who they are.
Those would be lumped into Canada, which is the largest number here.
That is my largest fear. Yeah. Anyway, enough about us. I want to say hi to all the listeners in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and other regions.
And other regions, which I'm going to assume are all the scientists in the Antarctic base.
That's right.
Listening to the Numinous podcast.
That's right.
Stay warm down there.
And remember, this podcast is a complement to the Numinous School, my online intuition development course. And if you'd like to be notified when registration reopens in June, hop onto my website and sign up for my newsletter. While you're there, you'll see the dates for my wilderness quest in 2017. You and me and Ruben bantering just like this, but about even more important things like your spiritual health and well-being. Get all the details at carmenspagnola.com. CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.